So our next speaker is Veronica Barassi, who researches and writes about the impact of data technologies and artificial intelligence on human rights and democracy. She is a professor in media and communication studies at the University of St. Gallen, which I have probably pronounced incorrectly, and please correct me. And she's also the chair of media and culture in the Institute of Media and Communication Management. For more than 5 years, Veronica has investigated the impact of children's data traces on their civic rights and the meaning of a society which datafies its citizens from before birth. She authored the book Child Data Citizen: How Tech Companies Are Profiling Us from Before Birth with MIT Press in 2020. And last year, she launched the Human Error Project, AI, Human Nature, and the Conflict Over Algorithmic Profiling, which combines anthropological theory with critical data and AI research and aims to investigate the fallacy of algorithms when it comes to reading humans. And her talk that she's going to do this morning will draw on recent findings from the Human Error Project. So over to you, Veronica.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me here. It is an honor to talk to you about my most recent research. What I'm going to do today is kind of talk about my research journey, how I started from the Child Data Citizen project and landed into the Human Error Project. Some of the key findings over the last, actually it's 2 years that we've been working on the Human Error Project. So I'm going to kind of show some of our first findings of the project. Now, my presentation is stuck. No, it's not. Thank you. So yeah, over the last years, I have been working on a project that really kind of tried to question the implications of all the data traces that were being collected from citizens from before birth. And what I found out, it was that if we actually work with families and we look at children, we are looking at a massive amount of data that is being collected from pregnancy apps and web searches or virtual assistants in the home, to data that is in the schools, to data that is collected from health providers. And the other aspect that really fascinated me, it was that the big tech positioned themselves in a very particular position because they are literally trying to harness all the different forms of data from different contexts. So in my Child Data Citizen book, I talked about how when we think about citizens' data that is being collected from the big tech, we have to, it's not about personal data, it's about different contextual forms of data: home life data, social media data, health data, and education data. And I talk about how the big tech actually have the possibility of bringing all this data together under a unique ID profile that follows people across a lifetime. Over the last year, I published another book in Italian from Lewis Press, which actually revisited most of the topics that I discussed within the Child Data Citizen book, but by looking more at the issue of how profiling is done, how AI technologies operate to profile human beings, what mistakes they make, but also the implications of the pandemic over the identification of citizens from birth. I am very much interested in this idea that we have created the technologies that can read and understand humans, and that we can predict their behavior. I'm also very much interested in the ethical implications of this. Now, one of the key findings of my research with families, I'm an anthropologist by training, and I did that ethnographic research with families. I did the autoethnographic research on my own family. I combined this with other type of methodologies, like this study of data privacy apps, of patent requests, and a much more kind of political economic analysis. So I kind of combined the two aspects in my Child Data Citizen book. But working with families, one of the things that I really came across was that people felt that the way in which they were being profiled on the internet was just plain wrong. It was reductionist in essence. It was unjust, and also it was just wrong. For instance, Cara in Los Angeles one day told me, you know, when I think about all this surveillance, I feel as if I were the object, like I was being constantly objectified. We do not have a choice. You don't have privacy. You don't have anything. I feel as if I'm being belittled, minimized, and invaded. I feel little. How else can I explain it? I feel that it is too big for me. I can't fight it. I can't defend myself. I am completely powerless. I feel as if I'm being used because they could do whatever they want with the data and turn it against you. This idea of being belittled by data really struck with me. Another informant said, you know, data trackers on the internet are like gossipers. And, you know, because when people seem to infer something about you on the basis of a certain information or a certain rumor, then that's wrong. It feels like gossiping. When I get targeted for a search I have done on Google, it feels like that, exactly that, like someone has been gossiping about me. This idea that, you know, we bought over the last 20 years into the promise of surveillance capitalism, of profiling technologies, that they can understand humans, but actually when you go and talk to humans, they feel belittled and objectified, and it's plainly wrong, right? Having said that, AI and human profiling are actually everywhere. You know, if you're talking about recruitment softwares that are being used to analyze facial features, you're talking about facial recognition technologies in schools, you're talking about home technologies that have to profile whether my cold is actually a sign of depression or not. And we have all these technologies that are used also for predictive policing and governmental practices. So there's this kind of idea that, yes, these technologies are actually very useful to profile individuals and to predict possible risks and mitigate risks. But over the last years, what we actually realized, it was that these technologies often get it wrong. They get it wrong because they're biased, because they don't get the context. And when they get it wrong, they can be extraordinarily violent. They can be extraordinarily unjust. And over the last years, I wrote a couple of pieces on this. My thesis supervisor during my PhD was David Graeber. And when he died, I went back to his writings, especially on the utopia of rules. And I kind of wrote an article on how his theory actually enables us to understand surveillance capitalism. But David wrote a lot about bureaucratic violence. And in anthropology, you find a lot of theory about the structural balance of bureaucratic systems. And that's a very interesting theory for me, which I find is completely missing from critical data studies or critical AI studies, who tend to disregard anthropological insights when it comes to this. But actually, if you're looking at works like, I don't know, Padurai data colonialism, or earlier anthropological works also on bureaucracy and automation and structural violence, it's a very interesting theoretical framework to embrace, to understand what's happening now. If you look at the work of Graeber, Graeber talks about how bureaucracy, and he's very much interested in the rise of corporate bureaucracy that actually developed from the 70s up until now. And the bureaucracy has become a place in which we construct social truths. And of course, automated systems are an advanced form of the paperwork that he was talking about, right? So I've been writing about this, the data inequality and how automated system can really impact on our democracies by bringing in the anthropological theory. But that's not exactly, I had also a bit of a frustration, right? Because what I found is that over the last years, not only the debate about data inequality has been very much concentrated in a specific area of the world. So we have like a lot of very US-centric visions of what racism, of what sexism is. And there are scholars and great scholars and friends of mine like Emiliano Trere or Stefania Milan, who have been writing about, you know, how can we think about this from the global south? But still, those, or even Payala Aurora has written a lot about this. But still, the debate is so US-centric. And that was a great frustration for me. The second great frustration for me was that whilst I don't want to belittle at all the importance of highlighting data inequality, I found myself reading texts that were very similar, like journal articles about sexist and racist algorithms were often coming back to the same argument, right? Which is a very important argument, but I always felt that there was a kind of a stuckness in the debate. So, and I think, I think over the last, especially between 2018 and 2021, we actually have seen a rise of very important debates. Kate Crawford is a great example of this, like the idea that of looking at how our technologies are based on a long history of human reductionism and colonialism, and the fact that they won't get it right, because of that, because the science behind this technology is flawed, it's biased. So all these are very important debates. But my question is, okay, but what are we doing as a society? We recognize this. We recognize that it's linked to big questions about political economy, but what next? What are we doing as a society? And again, in my interest in this debate is that from an anthropological perspective, these technologies are always, to me, they're always going to be flawed when it comes to profiling humans. There's nothing that can be said about this, and because they rely on a history of human reductionism and of scientific bias, because they rely on a very specific understanding of what humans are. A beautiful teaching that comes from anthropology is very much the idea that our vision of human nature is very Western-centric. And in a very small book by Salins, which is called The Western Illusion of Human Nature, he ends the book by saying, it's all been a huge mistake. My modest conclusion is that Western civilization has been constructed on a perverse and mistaken idea of human nature. Sorry, I beg your pardon. It was all a mistake. It is probably true, however, that this perverse idea of human nature endangers our existence. Now, Salins was very much interested in the idea that when we think about human nature in Western thought, so we have this feeling that human nature is evil, or that, we have this kind of Hobbesian idea that if we actually let people be what they are, the evilness of human nature comes across, the selfishness of human nature comes across. But him, and again with Weber in 2017, have revisited this argument by showing how when you think about human nature, there's a great deal of solidarity, there's a great deal of collectivism, there's a great deal of positive thinking that often is not transferred in dominant understanding of human natures, right? So when I was kind of started thinking about all these topics and how our technologies are sexist and racist, human reductionist and biased, I also kind of started thinking, most of the ideas of human nature that they have are very Western-centric, and they're very specific to Western-centric. And actually, going back to Jonathan's presentation, if you read the Lambda interview, what Lambda says humans are, it is very Western-centric. It's totally taken from texts and cultural products that are us, right? And it's quite fascinating. So I started thinking about those images of human nature within our technologies, but also on the fact that how did we deal with the fact that our technologies were fundamentally mismeasuring us, that they were connected to misreadings of what humans were. And a fascinating article in this regard for me, what was very influential, it was Stefania's Milan article, which looked at how the standard human in COVID apps, and how these apps were based on a standard understanding of what the human was, that did not embrace what Escobar, who's another anthropologist, describes as the pluriverse of human existence, right? So this idea that actually we have this kind of, and the standard means that we measure man with. And of course, this debate is not new. If you look at the gold, the mismeasure of man in 1981 was very much looking at how scientific knowledge is based on the standardization of humanity, but that standardization is often the white man. And another fascinating book in this regard is Strings, who actually looked at apps and technologies for fitness and the body mass index, and how the body mass index has been calculated on the basis of white women or white men, and completely disregarding the fact that actually for a Black woman having a specific body mass might mean healthiness. Like, you know, so it's this kind of understanding that within our technologies there are profound mismeasure of men. But having said that, these are the debates that are emerging and that have been emerging for around 5 years now. And I was interested to see what next, you know, you know, okay, we know that our algorithms are flawed, we know our technologies are flawed, but then how can we push the argument a little bit further? And that's why I came up with the idea of the Human Error Project, which is very much interested in understanding how we are negotiating with the error of our technologies when it comes to reading humans. Now, one of the big questions of my research is about algorithmic profiling and humans, right? There's many other ethical implications when it comes to AI, but there is also some other good ways in which we are using data through AI. Say, for instance, the measuring of climate change or measuring of diseases and how we understand diseases, right? So for me, it's very important that in the debate of AI ethics, we start making a difference about what type of technologies we're talking about. Because the problem is that if I use a technology to predict the course of a disease and I make a mistake, I could add more data and kind of try to rectify that mistake. But if I use the technologies for predicting a crime and then I jail someone and I maybe send them to jail for 40 years, there's no way of really fixing the human error in AI. That's what my understanding is. So I think it's very important to focus on algorithmic profiling and humans because of that. The other issue that I think is that when you look at the human error in AI, you look at different forms of error. One error is, of course, the algorithmic bias, which is debates have been very much addressing this issue. Our technologies are culturally specific and they are often reproduce a system of inequality that we have. So the databases as well. So that's kind of clear, right? Another fundamental aspect that kind of think emerges more through ethnographic research and anthropological research on the ground is that there is a human disconnect between our digital practices and our everyday intentions and behaviors. Although we are fed by the Silicon Valley with this idea that what we do online actually mirrors what we are or what we think, and actually can enable us to predict the intention that we have next. So this idea of when I was working in family life, I realized how messy is the data we produce when we are in an everyday setting. It's messy, it's complex, many times it's very inaccurate, right? You know, like I might have an anxiety because I heard that I don't know, a child in my school has potential COVID symptoms, and then I go and Google what are the symptoms of COVID, but that doesn't make me the one sick, you know, like it's a, but it's this idea that there is a greater complexity in human practices and digital practices than what we are told there is. And then there is another fundamental problem, which is the problem of algorithmic and accountability. Most of the technologies we have are generally unaccountable in the sense that a lot of the designers themselves and engineers themselves don't really know how to explain the predictions that these technologies are leading them to. Now I know that there is a big movement for accountable AI, and I think that's a very welcoming that, but still we are talking about very complex technologies that have a learning process that has come to evade what we really understand in some ways. And so because they, like in the case of Lambda, they are trained on data sets that are what trillions of words and texts and dialogues and that do escape our understanding. So so there is this idea that, you know, if we can't really explain how they make decisions or how they profile people, how can we really believe that that profiling is true, right? So this idea of the human error for me was working at different levels. Another aspect that for me was very much interesting, it was that, okay, so our technologies have a profound human error, but how are we dealing as a society with this idea of error, right? And I was very much influenced by the idea that, you know, errors in life have, you know, the errors have a life of their own. They have a political life of their own. There's a beautiful article that stresses on this, which from Aradao and Blanque, which is called, which talks about the political life of errors. And they actually look at the errors in facial recognition technology. They use some case studies to prove there. But I love their theoretical positioning because they say, you know, concerns with errors, mistakes, and inaccuracy have shaped political debates about what technologies do and where and how certain technologies can be used and for which purposes. A human error in AI then, to me, becomes a problem, raises discussions and debate, incites new reactions, and induces a crisis in the previously silent behavior habits, practices, and institutions. So to me, then the understanding that increasingly more as we are talking about how technologies get it wrong in understanding humans is actually taking a life on its own. And it's very important to map the political life of the errors. How are we as a society making up for these errors or making meaning out of these errors? How are we, what solutions are we looking for, you know? I'm not saying that we're gonna find the solutions, but it's actually about that process of exploration that I think it's very important. And that's why I launched the Human Error Project, idea of like to understand how are we making sense of this all. Just a note, there's a book by Padra and Alexander on failure, and they actually very much talk about failure and neoliberalism, and it's a very interesting book. But I'm not very much interested in the political and economic analysis of error. I'm more interested in how errors affect technological imaginaries and the political discourse that we're building around technologies. So it's just a different approach that derives from, I think, my background. Now, what I had as a problem when I was designing the Human Error Project, it was that, again, I am an ethnographer, I'm an anthropologist, but actually I thought that I needed to move beyond the ethnography and anthropology for itself and actually find a much broader methodological approach to understand the political life of errors. And so I decided to divide the Human Error Project in two different points. Two different stages. One first stage, which was about mapping the debate around, and I decided to focus on mainstream media discourse and reporting of AI errors. You know, what are mainstream media saying about when technologies get it wrong, right? And what type of discourses, what type of beliefs, what type of solutions are they advocating? And then the second side of the error project was very much interested in looking at the human stories behind the critique to that error. Now, this is very interesting that Jonathan mentioned Boltanski before, because I was, when I was designing the Human Error Project, I was very much influenced by Boltanski and Chiapello's work on social critique, and how often change within our society, especially during capitalism, happens because at a certain point, social critiques pushes against the moral justification of capitalism. And so people have to try to start rebuilding their moral justification. And in some ways, I thought that over the last 5 years, we actually seen a moment in which the moral justification of surveillance capitalism is being questioned by social critiques, by civil society organizations, but also by different ways of understanding tech. So what I decided to do, it was to look at alternative visions of AI development and to work with civil society organizations, as well as the ones that we define critical tech entrepreneurs, which are people that have decided that if they are building a home technology for children, that technology is going to be completely privacy by design or completely different from other type of technology or offline, or like there's a lot of different type of tech that is promoting ideas that challenge the ways in which tech is imagined in the Silicon Valley, simply by saying, for instance, we can have a good AI without taking so much personal data. We can have ways to do this differently, right? So I was very much interested in mapping also those efforts and those alternative imaginaries and voices. And so for the first part, what we did, it was a critical discourse analysis of mainstream media. And we focused on three main European countries. Now, European, you're going to forgive me that I'm putting the UK into the European context, but because I always thought that the UK was within the European context. So this is, but it was like, we actually looked at newspapers in Germany, in France, and the UK. And we identified them across the different political spectrum, so going from extreme left to extreme right, and then we followed the newspaper for the space of 2 years and looked at how they were reporting on AI errors. And we also sometimes we had to complement with articles that were also in the US or in Switzerland. And other countries, because maybe they refer to a specific case, like for instance, the Google dermatology app getting it wrong or something like that. Overall, we kind of tried to focus on keywords and look for specific keywords on both the newspapers that we were following, but also Google searches of keywords, and kind of focused on algorithmic error, algorithmic bias and accuracy, algorithmic profiling, AI ethics, data rights. So all those articles that we could find that were dealing with these keywords, we tried to analyze them. And our analysis was that the mainstream media is becoming very much a space for talking and rethinking about how technologies misunderstand and mismeasure humans. But one interesting point that was coming from our analysis, it was that often the error was framed as the fact that these technologies were missing the human, right? So they were like, often, so for instance, we collected different errors of AI in health apps that would get it wrong. And people were raising serious concerns about apps that try to predict the disease and get it wrong. Also concerns that could actually impact on society, for instance, or like in overdiagnosis would lead to an oversaturation of the health systems, or a misdiagnosis would lead to death. But often when there was this debate about it, around it, we found that a lot of it was about the missing doctor. Of course, they get it wrong because they don't have the human understanding or the human intelligence that we do. They're very rarely articles would kind of identify issues, for instance, of scientific racism, the fact that these technologies are based often on data sets that lack a careful understanding of different human skins, for instance. So, and usually it was the more complex debates about scientific racism were actually articulated by either more specific or more left-leaning newspapers. And that's what we found out, of course, and that's not surprising. Another aspect that we found out, it was that often the media frame was very much US-centric. So this debates would always be discussed with reference to what was happening in the US. So the US was this big ideal, and also reliant on always the same type of experts, and very lack of alternative voices like civil society organizations who are working on the ground very hard, like very extensively to go against algorithmic bias or algorithmic injustice in general. So, and this was kind of we're working at the moment on our report, on our research report, which is hopefully going to be published in some sometimes in the future. I don't know exactly when, because we've been overwhelmed with stuff. But that's the first stage of the Human Error Project. The second stage of the Human Error Project, again, it was to look at what people said they did in terms of looking for alternatives. And this second stage really focused on civil society organization in Europe, and as I said before, critical tech. The civil society organizations in Europe interviews have been finalized and the mapping has been done. So I can present it today. We kind of, what we did, it was to work on two different levels. On the one hand, we kind of mapped these organizations from Algorithm Watch to many different other organizations, how they were operating in Europe. And we analyzed what they said they did on their websites, what they were like, what is that they are going against, and what type of alternatives they're looking. And then we also kind of interviewed 35 members of these organizations through in-depth qualitative interviews, which basically kind of we realized that they were kind of covering around 15 different European countries. And our research questions were very much concerned on 4 different dimensions. First, we wanted to know what everyday experience of algorithmic technologies, what was their everyday experience of algorithmic injustice, what led them to fight for algorithmic justice, what problems they faced when they tried to implement their strategies, and how they're trying to resist those problems. But also how they imagine the future, and this is something that I think it's very important. How do they imagine the alternative in the future? So, and what we found is that these organizations are operating at different levels, many different levels. One is the idea of discursive resistance, and to kind of really reclaim how things are talked about, right? So this idea that they want to reclaim the language. So for instance, they would say things like, I wouldn't refer to AI technologies because that's too vague. I think you need to split the debate between, on the one hand, automated system, which have been there for quite a long time. And on the other hand, you have platform monopolies, which also claim the use of AI, but present a much newer set of issues. So you have like kind of this different ideas of how they're reclaiming the power of naming of Melucci, how they're trying to reclaim that the language. There's also the importance of education, the fact that people are not that educated and that their role is to educate people. Importance of legislation to try to kind of, for instance, to reclaim the your face campaign in Europe. It was really much about going against facial recognition technologies, but also litigation, you know, on the ground, going and saying, how can we go against Amazon? How can we make use of the GDPR and things like that? So there were a lot of different practices of resistance that we actually met when talking with civil society organizations. But also what we found very interesting was that they are talking about the futures in very different ways. I know I'm sorry for a lot of text, but it was kind of like, so for instance, there's with both the thinking very utopian visions of how the futures can be reclaimed, but also dystopian visions of what the future could come and bring. And there was a hope for different futures, especially when people talked about feminist tech policies or indigenous AI or other ways of thinking about solutions, but very much the idea of changing the power to decide, the right not to be judged. Another good idea was the algorithmic repositories to keep people more, to keep this technology more accountable. But then, like, when people were also very not happy with what's happening, especially at governmental level, and in terms of implications for democracy, and we collected the different perspectives about this. One quote that I thought it was very interesting, it was, "A world seen by an engineer is a set of as a set of problems and a set of solutions." Is not the type of world that we want to see. We want to talk and think about the world in much more complex way, and for its ambiguity of being human and so on. So in conclusion, what I have more questions, to be honest. I am at that stage in a project in which I have preliminary findings and I have more questions than real conclusions. I think it's essential to look at the political life of errors in AI, because the way in which we claim this error, the way in which we hide these errors could have massive implications for our society. I don't know if you noticed the tweet everybody's going around recently about the Bloomberg article about predictive policing, being able to predict the crime with a week in advance, right? And actually the headline was like that. And and you're thinking, why are you doing this to society? That's not how we should talk about these technologies. These technologies have enormous power when it comes to, again, what I was saying before, some of our scientific discoveries, especially for instance in AI in health, are fundamental. But if we forget to look at the way in which these technologies misread and misunderstand humans, and the way in which as a society we are making sense of this misunderstanding, I think this could lead only to a much more dark future than what we can envisage. And I'm not a techno pessimistic. I don't want to say this is the way things will be, but I think it's very important to reclaim and give voice to the people that are actually looking for alternatives and alternative imaginations in all this. Thank you.